this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Jardiance has a big story to tell. Discover Jardiance empagliflozin 10 or 25 milligram tablets. Visit Jardiance.com, call 1-888-968-6648, or talk to your doctor to see if Jardiance is right for you.
A little pill with a big story to tell.
This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 1117 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. On last week's show, I talked to Evan Silva about a handful of players that we're targeting in drafts this year. That's just based off of where we have them ranked and where they typically get drafted. Today, we're doing the opposite of that. We're looking at players to avoid. And to help me out, I brought on my friend Rich Hribar of Sharp Football Analysis. I brought 5 players to the table. He brought 5 players to the table. It's not that we're fading these guys no matter what, but we do think they're a little bit overvalued by the market. Now, before getting into that conversation, I just want to send another reminder to check out the Late Round Draft Guide. There's well over 270 pages of content that includes game theory, strategy, ways to spot breakouts and bust, players to target, players to avoid, and more. You get cheat sheets with the guide as well, and everything is updated weekly. Check it out, learn more, lateround.com. Now let's get to these 10 players to avoid with Rich Hribar. All right, Rich, welcome back. Another year of targets and avoids. This year you are on the avoid show. Always the more difficult show to do. It's a little bit tough to talk avoids because, you know, people come after us a little bit more with these. You know, it's a tougher topic to dig into. But again, these are simply players that we like a little bit less than what the market does, right? Like that's what this really comes down to. It's not even a full fade situation. If these guys are available at the right spot, we'll still take them. But yeah, I mean, these are players that generally we're not drafting a ton of because we don't think they should be going as high as they are. So with that being said, Rich, give us the first player that you're generally avoiding this year.
Yeah, I also think too the avoids have gotten a little tougher in over the years, just because I think the general consumer is a lot sharper and the market's just being set a lot better in fantasy football. But yeah, I'm going to start off with a couple, higher price guys here. And it's not like you said, it's not that they're necessarily avoids. It's that I think that they're a little bit overpriced or like players that are typically go after them more than them. So yeah, I'm going to start with Jonathan Taylor, and I think that one might be a little bit surprising to people. The guy that led the NFL in rushing attempts, rushing touchdowns, and had 85% of the Indianapolis backfield touches. Really doesn't have any competition again this year. Those are all very high notes for Jonathan Taylor. He's finished as an RB1 scorer in 4 of his 6 seasons. The only blemish was something that we saw at the end of last year, even with Daniel Jones' starts, that's gone on for his career. It's that when the Colts struggle as a unified team and winning games, this is where Jonathan Taylor typically slows down. He's the highest correlated running back in terms of like winning and losing. And that's been a thorn for his entire career. He's averaged 22.7 PPR points per game for his career in wins. That is the most of any active running back since he entered the NFL. He goes to RB15 in losses. Last year, he averaged 32 points per game in wins, 12.3 PPR points per game in losses. And even if we remove all the Phillip Rivers, all the Riley Leonard stuff, and his 4 losses that Daniel Jones played in full, he was the RB21, RB29, RB28, RB18 in those games. And why that is noteworthy as we head into 2026, we got Daniel Jones returning from an Achilles injury. Michael Pittman's gone. Braden Smith's gone. We don't know when Alec Pierce is coming back at this point. Alec Pierce is a pretty big deal because he's the only guy in the offense that can stretch the field. Over the past 2 years, Jonathan Taylor's faced 8 or more defenders in the box on 43.2% of his runs with Alec Pierce off the field. That's 155 attempt sample, too. It's not like 25 carries or anything. And then with Alec Pierce on the field, it goes all the way down to 28.7% because you have to respect Alec Pierce stretching the field, occupying a box defender. Right now, the Indianapolis Colts are only favored in 6 games on their schedule. That's 21st in the league. They have a really tough opening gauntlet. They go Baltimore, Kansas City, Houston. They have an international game against Washington, which we're not scared of. But then after that international game, they forego the bye week and on a short week go to Pittsburgh. And then And so it's like, this is a really tough opening schedule for them. And then when you look at the Indianapolis Colts, just they're a team, when I do my team regression series, that just kept popping up series after series. Jonathan Taylor scored the most points from fantasy from the 1 yard line last year, almost 20 more fantasy points than he had scored in any previous seasons. No team was better last year at converting goal to go opportunities than the Colts. They scored an offensive touchdown 94% of their goal to go opportunities. It was the third best rate for any team in the 2000s, and it was a 32 trip sample too. Sometimes you see these teams like convert 90%, but they only have like 15 chances or something like that. Right. And then they scored on 51.5% of their drives, which was the most in the NFL. Since 2010, there have been 24 other teams to score on at least half of their possessions. 20 of those 24 teams scored fewer touchdowns the following season with an average loss of 12 touchdowns per team. So yeah, when I line up all the things for Jonathan Taylor, it just kind of I look at other guys that are growing in his area, like, Chase Brown, even Saquon Barkley. These are guys I think that I just have a little bit higher than him and have more faith in their team environments than Jonathan Taylor. It's not that I'm out on Jonathan Taylor. I just have him more lower as like more of a floor-based RB1, kind of like this year's Saquon, where we were with Saquon last year. Yeah. Statistically, I think he's still going to be an RB1, but are you getting like that weekly hammer with any consistency? I think it's going to be a lot more volatile this year.
I think straight up, the reason that this is an avoid for me too, if you want to dumb it down, is simply that I like James Cook a lot more, or at least a decent bet more, like a 70-30 type outcome situation with the two of them versus Jonathan Taylor. The thing with like a James Cook profile is that there's a very clear path of room for growth with James Cook, and that's in the receiving column, right? Like if reports are true and they do use him more, and obviously you have this like Ty Johnson thing going on, which actually could help Cook a little bit. But with Jonathan Taylor, like there's not much room for growth. He's seen 92% and 86% running back rush shares over the last 2 years. That's elite numbers that I think projection wise, you can probably put him in that bucket, but that's still a really hard to sustain number. And we've seen a very, very large sample now of Jonathan Taylor not being a huge pass catcher. Wasn't really a huge pass catcher in college. I'm not saying he can't do it, but wasn't a huge pass catcher in college. And then he still hasn't seen more than 11% target share in the NFL. So like, there's not that much room for growth for him. And then, like you said, it comes down to that environment, and the environment is very, very, very scary. I mean, the Colts through the first 10 weeks last year, they're first in points per game, first in drives ending in touchdowns, first by a wide margin in percentage of touchdowns that came on the ground too. Like they were scoring, very much via the ground, which is something that regresses. So I'm with you with Jonathan Taylor. You're probably a little bit lower than I am, but it's still a fade for me generally. Like he was a player in the draft guide immediately upon release, where I will say I cooled off a tiny bit because when I released that, the Daniel Jones stuff was still very much up in the air. It sounds like that's at least a little bit better, but now you have the Alec Pierce thing too, and it's all just pointing to a scarier profile than I think people realize. Yeah,
and I still have him like 9th overall. It's just like I've got him in a spot to where I always want to steer people to like where they're taking James Cook, Chase Brown, Saquon, and I have Kenneth Walker over him too, which a lot of people probably bristle at because we've done the Kenneth Walker thing before, but definitely look at his environment and his opportunity as being a little bit more stable as well. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to move on to a player that everyone's been making fun of me for because I bring him up on every show as like an example of the kind of player that I don't typically draft, and that's Courtland Sutton. Okay. This to me profiles as a single, not a home run type player. And when you're in the middle rounds, I want that triple. I want that home run. Like I want to go for a player that I think has a legitimately high ceiling. I mean, he averaged fewer than 13 PPR points per game last year in a wide receiver room that was, beatable on paper. You had a rookie Pat Bryant, Troy Franklin, who essentially lost his gig as the season went on. Franklin went from being their wide receiver one, if you will, and I'll get to that in a second, to then, losing a lot of snaps. And obviously now they have Jalen Waddle. But last year, Courtland Sutton had a 21% target share. His targets per out run rate was under 20%. It's not like he was being hyper targeted in this offense without Jalen Waddle, right? And this is also an offense that doesn't necessarily just feed their X. And I think that is very, very key for what they did in getting Jalen Waddle. Last year, Troy Franklin was playing that Z role, and we saw, remember that 5-week stretch where Franklin was like getting 8+ targets per game, and the narrative was Troy Franklin is the Broncos wide receiver one. I think that's very much role based, but the difference is that instead of Troy Franklin playing that role, you have Jalen freaking Waddle playing that role, who's one of the most efficient, better wide receivers in the entire game. So much tougher competition for Courtland Sutton. Not only that, last year he ran the third most routes in football. Like, there was a team that I do expect to still drop back to pass a decent bit. We saw that the last basically since Bo Nix has taken over. But he had the third most routes in football. He barely eclipsed 1,000 yards despite that. He had a 1.62 yards per route run rate. And now he's entering year 9, and he hasn't topped 2 yards per route run in years. I mean, he hasn't been that efficient of a receiver at all for a while. So my TLDR with Sutton is that, like, he's fine. I just don't want to draft fine when I get into the middle rounds of drafts. And I know that people who play best ball are sitting there being like, first off, this is not a best ball take so much. Like, I think that he can have spiked weeks, but people look at best ball ADP and they think that that's like where Sutton will go in a season long draft, but he goes a lot higher. There's platforms like on Yahoo where he's going ahead of guys like Parker Washington, Josh Downs, even some running backs that I like more. If you look at ESPN, he's going way higher. He's going over some very, very legitimate, like guys that I have in my top 25, top 30 at wide receiver on that platform. And maybe not in your league, that doesn't happen. But I mean, I've been in drafts already where Sutton's a more of a brand name, household name, and it's a good offense that we want to invest in because of Sean Payton. And he's just not giving you that crazy upside. I just worry a lot about what this looks like with Jalen Waddle entering the picture, considering the fact that Sutton still only had a 21% target share last year without Jalen Waddle. I think it's a big, big problem. So he's just not someone that I'm going after this year.
Yeah, it's hard to disagree with that one at all. I mean, he was outside of the top 40 in targets per out run and yards per out run last year. And like you said, just against way weaker competition that we'll have this year. And the run game should be better. That's when they really swerved into the pass last year, was after the Dobbins injury. And now that they have Jonah Coleman as insurance for if and when Dobbins, misses time for this season, that they won't have to go extremely that pass heavy, that they'll be able to be a lot more balanced. And like you said, I mean, it wasn't even a 5-week game, but it was from weeks 2 to 11 that Troy Franklin out-Suttoned him, out-targeted Sutton, out-Suttoned him too. Yeah. And what's crazy about that was, especially with Jalen Waddle, because you think about Sutton and you're like, well, he'll still have like touchdown equity, right? Like, he's the big clasher, but it was actually Franklin was out targeting him in the end zone. And Troy Franklin, one of the weirder things about him is they had all these plays dialed up for him in the end zone. And he had like 3 2-point conversions too, which don't even count on like the end zone target stuff. But like that's all stuff like Jalen Waddle can do. And the other thing too with adding Jalen Waddle is Sutton's going to have a lot more deeper like depth of target. He's going to lose some of those intermediate, like those fantasy smoothing routes. We don't want to lean just in on those guys that requires like playing the boundary X and doesn't get a lot of those free squares. So yeah, he's a guy I haven't even thought about drafting once in like a managed league yet. Yeah.
I mean, like I said, I think you could make the case easily in best ball because your consideration set should be pretty wide in a best ball environment. But yeah, in season long in a managed league, it's a lot more difficult. All right, Rich, give me your next player here.
Yeah, this one is one that I think some other gamers have too, and you've probably heard this one before too. But it's similar adjacency to my Jonathan Taylor take. It's not that I think this guy is going to be like brick out, but Devon Achane is he's just in a very unique case here, and especially with like a lot of the conversation that goes around him. So one thing I didn't bring up with Jonathan Taylor here, because it definitely applies more so for Devon Achane than Jonathan Taylor, is you look at since 1990. Yearly top 3 scorers at the running back position. Like we talk about ceiling, right? Like ceiling is what we look for. They've played for teams that average 9.9 wins per season. Just 17 of those backs, which is 16.7%, played for teams that won fewer than 8 games. If we extend that out to top 6 scorers per year, that goes to 9.6 wins per season. And over that same period, only 18.8% of those guys, for top 12 guys, that is, have been on teams that win 6 or fewer games in a season. Like you can do it because 18%, it's what, out of 12 guys, we're still getting 1 to 2 of those guys a year, right? So you still could be that one, but are you going to cut your teeth and say, I'm going to get the one? Right. We have a few of these guys down here at the bottom this year, Ashton JT's down here. Jeremiah Love was pushing that. I think we're going to see him not get there in terms of ADP. But the other thing too with Achane is, he's clearly the best player that Miami has on offense. So it's easy to expect him being like the centerpiece of the offense, but we still need to price in some fragility with all these moving parts. The crazy part to me is that we already have a sample of this, right? Like he's played 8 games without Tua Tagovailoa over the past 2 seasons. And in those games, he averages 10.5 PPR points per game. He has one RB1 scoring week compared to 20.3 PPR points per game with Tua Tagovailoa. And now we lose Mike McDaniel on top of that. In the 2 games that Tua missed last year, like things didn't bottom out. He was the RB14, the RB17, because again, that touch volume, right? 18 touches, 21 touches in those games. But we didn't have the ceiling that we were accustomed to. Now we're getting, this offense with Malik Willis, and it's just going to reduce the overall passing upside of this team. With Malik Willis on the field for his career, offenses have thrown the ball 40% of the time. In Green Bay, it was 38.7%. It's probably going to be proxy, just be higher than that, but they're going to be a run-based team here. We talk about it all the time, too, with like running backs attached to mobile passers. Malik Willis is number 1 in the NFL since the NFL in scramble rate, highest league, 14.5%. Now, his target rate to running backs is only 10.2%, but it's going to go up by default of throwing to Achane versus, Josh Jacobs and, Derrick Henry. But it's still going to be something that lowers based on Tua. We saw Achane play with Tyler Huntley. He ran 85 routes with Tyler Huntley, and Tyler Huntley starts. He was targeted 6 times on those 85 routes. Yeah. And then when you talk about, a lot of people say, well, Miami was already bad last year, right? Let's add some context to the 2025 Dolphins. This was a way more competent team than I think anyone remembers them being. They won 7 games. They were 16th in rate of snaps led last year, 1 spot behind the Buffalo Bills. They were 14th in snap rate trailing, ahead of the Lions, ahead of the Bills. They even led by double digits at the 7th highest rate in the NFL last year. Like, this is not the same environment for a team that is favored in 1 game right now. They're projected to be 31st in scoring. They have an average margin of spread of minus 6.9 points. It's only the Arizona Cardinals are worse. These are not competitive, comparable, apples to apples, environments. Like, this is not where we hunt for upside in terms of team environment. Again, I think this is another guy that can maybe flirt with like being like an overall RB1. But we talk about this all the time, JJ, this time of year, where people cite like this guy was the RB9 or the RB11, or even from a points per game stance, and just like they don't apply any context like what that actually meant, right? Mm-hmm. Ask anyone if they owning Ashton Jainty as an RB1 last year felt like they had an RB1 when they set their lineup every week. And I think that's what we're getting here. I think this is going to be a very volatile weekly RB2 that could finish as an RB1.
Yeah, just to give you some more context and some more data around the team environment stuff, we look at team environment score in the draft guide this year. It's really just a way of putting a number to player ADP. So it just takes ADP of a certain team and it brings it together from an expected fantasy points scored perspective. And the number itself doesn't need to make any sense to you, but scores below 75, team environment scores below 75. There's been, since 2014, 14 running backs drafted in the top 10 at the position with team environment scores below 75, which is where Achane finds himself this year. 12 of those 14 then played at least 8 games that following season, that upcoming season. Only 3 of them outperformed ADP expectation, and the average running back played 2 points per game below expected, which is not good. I mean, that's a really, really bad hit rate. So everything you said, I totally agree with. And I know that people are going to say, again, in best ball, he goes later than what he goes on some of these platforms. CBS, ESPN, he's the RB5. Realistically, do I think Devon Achane's going to have a higher target share than like Chase Brown this year? Probably, maybe. But I think that it's probably closer than we would want to admit. And if it's closer than what we would want to admit, why would we be so anxious and ready to draft Devon Achane over a guy like Chase Brown when we know the environment is completely stable? So, that alone is a reason for me to be a little bit lower than the market on Devon Achane. Okay, next on my list, I already talked about one player from the Denver Broncos, so why not just double dip here and go with another one? I'm going to go with J.K. Dobbins as another player that I'm generally avoiding this year. And honestly, the logic's pretty similar to what I talked about with Cortland Sutton already, where I just see Dobbins as someone who is a single and not not even a double, I would argue, but just a single, definitely not a home run type player in the middle rounds. And I know that people will look at his ADP and say, oh, but RJ Harvey's going higher than Dobbins and yada, yada. Well, first off, on some platforms, that's not the case. Dobbins goes ahead of RJ Harvey on some platforms. But on the other side of that is, again, I'm shooting for upside. I would argue very strongly that the upside sits more with an RJ Harvey type, who's a second-year player, yes, had very questionable between the tackles numbers last year, but was a very good receiver, way better than Dobbins. And I'll just talk about that now because I'm talking about Dobbins. So I would argue that Dobbins was in a near ideal situation last year before he got hurt. RJ Harvey wasn't playing a ton on early downs. We were getting that rotation in Denver, but Dobbins was seeing a lot of work in that Denver backfield. So my first question to people who are very pro Dobbins is, do you still think that he's going to see that same kind of work? I think most would say, who are drafting him, would say, yes, he's going to see that kind of work and that, what he was getting pre-injury. I would argue then back, why are you so excited about this, right? His workload, he ran a route on just 30% of Denver's dropbacks last year when he was healthy. He had a 4.2% target share. His yards per route run, Rich, was 0.32, which RJ Harvey was actually really strong on a per route run basis. So I see no reason for them to all of a sudden change things up and not use Harvey in that pass catching role. And there's really no indication that that's going to be the case. Dobbins was good on the ground. There's no doubt. But the receiving profile is just really, really questionable. And if you look at how he actually performed on a points per game basis last year, he averaged 11.6 PPR points per game. Through week 10 last year, J.K. Dobbins was the RB24 in fantasy football under relatively ideal circumstances for him right now. And I say that because I don't think the workload is necessarily going to get better. All they did was add Jonah Coleman this offseason, who already has looked the part. I thought, I think you and I both really liked him as a prospect within the context of this class, of course. And then, RJ Harvey's another year in, he might end up being a little bit better. So I just see Dobbins really paying off only if RJ Harvey gets hurt, and Denver's able to use him more as a pass catcher. But even if that's the case, I think Jonah Coleman is still going to block him to some degree. And also we know that, I'm making this argument against Dobbins without even mentioning the fact that he's hurt every year, right? That he's been banged up year in and year out. And I could see a scenario where Denver wants to keep him fresh and keep him going, where they don't feed him that same workload that they did last year. And I think that's a huge reason as to why they went out and they got Jonah Coleman in the first place, is that he's a very steady all-around back. He can play a backup role to both RJ Harvey and J.K. Dobbins. And then on top of that, again, Coleman himself could end up taking some of the goal line work in this offense because of his size and not wanting Dobbins to be so banged up. So all of that to say, this is an ambiguous backfield, and I want to attack ambiguous backfields. I will attack ambiguous backfields. I've been drafting if I look at this backfield and the three of them, I've gotten the most Jonah Coleman of the three because it's very cheap to just go that route, and I can see what happens. More of a best ball thing because I haven't drafted so many teams to be able to say I'm definitively one way or another. But I definitely have been taking more RJ Harvey than J.K. Dobbins because, again, if you look at trends and what's worked out historically with middle round running backs, year two guys, pass catchers, and not overstating and overrating what they did on the ground the previous year, because ground game work does fluctuate quite a bit year over year. I don't think Harvey is more than likely going to be special or anything, right? But I do think that there are outs here where he could still outperform ADP and be better than where he's being drafted right now. It's just really hard for me to get there with J.K. Dobbins and making that same argument. So, to me, we've had this discussion before, and I know that you're a big arbitrage guy, but all summer long, my arbitrage with J.K. Dobbins has just been Jordan Mason, who, goes after. At one point, he was going like 3 or 4 rounds after. It's the same kind of bet. I mean, you could even squint and say Chris Rodriguez is the same kind of bet even later, right? I would much rather be spending those costs on these 2-down profiles than going for J.K. Dobbins.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there's a place. It's a bummer because J.K. Dobbins is a guy I think a lot of people want to root for.
Of course,
he's been snake bit. There's a place in the multiverse where this dude probably already has 7,000 rushing yards. At this point of his career, right. He was such a good prospect. He's just been, like I said, really snake bit. But 11 receptions last year for 37
Crazy.
Yards. He had 1 week last year where he finished as a top 24 running back without a touchdown. So if he doesn't score a touchdown, he's basically giving you 1 unusable production. And even with touchdowns, his highest scoring game was 15.5 PPR points. I did an article like 5 or 6 years ago on, how running back 2 production in your weekly lineup is like the most replaceable commodity that you can find. And that's like what we have here. Like there's no sense of paying a premium for this archetype, even in non-PPR, even if you're doing something that's half PPR or standard touchdown driven. You brought up Jordan Mason, typically goes about 2 rounds after him, almost 2 full rounds. Chris Rodriguez. You can even squint and say when Zach Charbonnet comes back, this is what Zach Charbonnet is. You can even tell yourself a song on like, this is what Tyler Algier is, which is probably not, but maybe.
Right.
But this type of guy is just so replaceable. And it's a bummer because, like I said, he's on a good team and you think like this archetype is going to get elevated because of that, but it's just not the case.
Yeah. And I know his ADP isn't out of control, but I don't want to use that as an excuse to draft players that I don't think can really give you that upside, right? Like there's still an opportunity cost to a degree in that area of drafts because the opportunity costs are players who do have that kind of upside, right? And like, again, it feels like I'm on an island with this take because it feels like a lot of analysts are way in on Dobbins this year and really do like him and hate RJ Harvey because he just wasn't very productive on the ground last year. But it's one of those things where, like, we know historically ground game numbers fluctuate, and what is stickier is the passing game work and how they're deployed that way. Not only that, we know the Sean Payton offense favors pass catching running backs and has historically. This isn't a pro Harvey argument by any means. Like, I've been like 1 or 2 running back spots ahead of market with Harvey. It's not like a strong stance or anything like that. It's more so me just saying I want to sit with the upside case and go with the upside play, as opposed to drafting a player like J.K. Dobbins. Like maybe in some environments, if he falls and you really, you went like hero RB and you really need you just need some production at running back, you click Dobbins' name. But it's even in that scenario, I'd rather just wait and try to get a Mason or something like that, who I think Mason might even have more upside than Dobbins because there's just less in his way in terms of competition and in terms of really pass catching stuff. And like I said, Dobbins' pass catching work last year, genuinely horrific. I mean, like the yards per route run stuff, 0.32, you almost never see a player come back from that and give you a good target share the following season. So just a lot of reasons why I'm out on Dobbins. All right, give me your next player, Rich.
All right, I started with at least some players at the top here. Now I'm gonna soften up a little bit, and this one's interesting because usually one of the tried and true ways I play fantasy football is, if a guy makes like a giant market jump from the previous year, it was like a cheap player that became real expensive. I always kind of question that of paying the iron price, and then inversely, when a player was really high priced and falls, I'm like more open to saying, hey, I'm gonna buy the discount. But in this case, I've had a really hard time warming up to Brian Thomas Jr. He's coming off of that down second season. Obviously I just don't think he was a fit for Liam Cohen's, system, which more of the intermediate crossing routes. And, he played through, wrist and shoulder injuries, that didn't help those things. But when the Jaguars kind of found their footing, because I think a lot of people forget, like the Jaguars were like an awful offense for like the first 8 weeks, like it's absolutely horrendous. But when they found their stride is when they made the trade for Jacoby Myers and then the elevation of Parker Washington to the Travis Hunter injury. Everyone kind of found their stride with Brian Thomas Jr. then in that point was playing the X wide receiver in this offense. We had Parker Washington and Jacoby Myers kind of fluctuating between slot Z. We had a little bit of sprinkling for slot stuff for Brian Thomas. So it was mostly those two guys that were intermixed. And when all 3 wideouts were on the field together, they were on the field for 106 routes together. And Thomas was third on that trio in target rate per route run at 17%, 21% for Myers, 26% for Parker Washington. I mean, Liam Cohen has said some positive things about Brian Thomas Jr. this season, but dude, he talks about Parker Washington like he is blood. But the thing is, they've already said, like, Brian Thomas Jr. is basically going to play primarily X in this offense. And from week 10 on, he averaged 17 air yards per target. 33% of his targets are 20 or more yards downfield. That is a very, very tough way to live as a viable weekly fantasy target. I mean, it's just really, you need those, like we talk about, those smoothing targets, those freebies in a sense. Like this, he was basically operating like Jacksonville Kayshon Boutte. That's like what his role was in the offense. And so if we think he's going to play primarily X, and like I said, he can still get a little bit of sprinkling. This Jacksonville schedule in terms of what they face in terms of outside perimeter play, and I'm like no like wide receiver, cornerback, like we have to fade all these guys. But listen to this schedule for Brian Thomas Jr. Denzel Ward, Patrick Surtain, Christian Gonzalez, DJ Turner, Quinyon Mitchell, Derek Stingley, bye week, Sauce Gardner. That is 8 weeks of the season. You're 8 weeks into the season. What week are you going to be like, I am confident putting Brian Thomas Jr. in my weekly lineup? Like, you're just hoping he scores a touchdown or cashes in a big play. Like, it's just really hard for me, I think, with all the tea leaves that saying, like, he's in a role in the offense that's not going to be conducive for consistent fantasy points, and then it's going to run up against, I think, the worst of the defensive opponents that Jacksonville faces over those opening 2 months. I have a hot take. I think we might see Brian Thomas Jr. in some like shallow managed leagues outright released, like at some point earlier in the 2026 season.
Yeah, I mean, I could see it. I remember, I was doing that early season schedule analysis episode, and I referenced a lot of sharp football stuff with the secondary rankings and whatnot, and Jacksonville popped up as okay, this could actually be pretty tough the first half of the season. Like it's a very, very tough schedule, and obviously, you noted him seeing the toughest matchups in that offense at wide receiver could end up being really tough. I hate to use this. I do think he is a better and best ball type player because the big playability is certainly there for a player like him, right? But I do think that there's going to be a lot of that unpredictability, to your point, in the way that this offense functions. And it just, all these signs just point to Parker Washington just being some of these platforms, he's still going so late. Washington, I'm still getting him at, way past wide receiver 30 price tags. And to me, he's just like easily the best Jacksonville wide receiver in fantasy this year. And this just plays into that a little bit more.
You made a great point. I think a lot of people think about better and a best ball as just like the big play archetype, but it's not necessarily that. It's because J.K. Dobbins fits that mold too. It's just knowing that you get the weeks that they hit in your lineup,
right?
And but in a managed league, like you have to guess that. Like if you want to get Brian Thomas Jr. right, like you basically just have to leave him you're going to have to just leave him in your lineup,
right?
And you're always going to question it. Like when you're looking, you're going to be like, oh, Brian Thomas Jr. is going against Patrick Surtain this week. Well, my wide receiver 5 has a pretty good matchup. Yeah. Should I go with him instead? Like that's what it's going to be like. I think for the first 2 months of the year,
I've taken Brian Thomas in one league so far out of the many managed leagues that I've drafted, and the one that I took him in was one of the Kings Classic ones. It was the auction, and the reason for that, well, I was kind of getting kind of scary with one of the players in that. I mean, it's a crazy draft, 14 teams.
Yeah, 14.
But there's deep starting lineups too, right? Where I think a player like this is a lot easier to take on when you don't have to make those decisions, right? Where you're just like, I'm just going to take the lows with the highs and then allow the other guys in the lineup to just kind of, be the baseline for me. But if you're starting 2 or 3 wide receivers, especially if it's like a 2 wide receiver, 1 flex league, he's just not somebody that's very appealing because of how unpredictable and volatile that production is going to be. So, and again, like I was going to say this, like the Dobbins thing, you bringing that up, I think that he's another guy, and Chris Rodriguez, and they're probably better in best ball players than they are in managed because yes, they're going to fall into the end zone. We don't know exactly when that's going to happen, and you don't have that baseline of them being reliable receivers to give you at least some production on the ground. So I'm with you. It's not only the big playability because. I mean, certainly J.K. Dobbins, you wouldn't look at him and be like, oh, this is a huge big play guy. But it's just the unpredictability aspect of things. And
it used to be the receiving running backs that archetype has kind of gone away a little bit, like the James Whites, because you never knew when James White was going to catch 10 passes. But in best ball, he actually was undervalued because you just get those weeks when he got them.
Yeah, exactly. When game script went south. Yeah. All right, I'm going to move on from the Broncos. I'm not going to name all.
Give us another Bronco. Do Bo Nix.
Yeah. No, Waddle would be on the other side of this list. We'll go with Matthew Stafford right now. I think that the quarterback market is pretty sharp this year, and it's kind of hard to really have like a hardcore fade. I'm just saying Stafford because if you do look at some season-long platforms, QB8 on ESPN right now, which is a lot higher than I expected. QB12 on CBS. I think Yahoo, it's a little bit more reasonable. The market is getting smarter though. Dating back to 2014. We've had 13 quarterbacks earn an ADP after posting a touchdown rate of at least 7% while averaging fewer than 5 fantasy points per game via rushing the previous season. So they weren't doing much on the ground, but they gave you that outlier touchdown rate season. every single one of those quarterbacks the following year were top 10 options. And the majority of them, the average was in the QB5 to QB6 range. So the fact that Matthew Stafford is at the highest being drafted as a low-end QB1 tells me that the market's getting sharper, because we know that touchdown rates regress. Stafford had a 7.7% touchdown rate last year. Of those 13 quarterbacks I just mentioned, 12 of them played at least 8 games the following year. And of those 12, these are guys who had a 7% touchdown rate or better. They averaged only 18 points per game the following year, which, the majority of them played below expectation. Obviously the Rams are going to be good this year, more than likely. So I don't want to discount that. But dating back to 2014, I think we also have to recognize that last year's Rams were 3rd in passing touchdowns per game. They were 6th in total touchdowns per game. That's all NFL teams across all those seasons since 2014. That was on a team, though, that was also 28th in yards per play. So they weren't as strong. They were just really good at converting last year. They were just a very, very strong offensive team. And they were 9th in percentage of drives across that time frame that ended in a touchdown. So, it was a very efficient offense that I question, will they be able to do that and repeat that year over year? I'd also argue that the defense could end up being a lot better. But I just think that it's a tough bet when I don't really see much of a difference between Matthew Stafford and like Jared Goff. I don't think there's any real difference from a projection standpoint. I'd maybe give Stafford the edge, like a 52 to 48 type edge, but that's not what ADP is going to show. You're going to be able to get Goff multiple rounds after that, on a lot of these sites. And then obviously there's players that you can draft late this year that are going to give you that 3 to 5 point per game with their legs. That's just really difficult for, we know Matthew Stafford's not going to get there. He's going to be under 1 this year. So, all of that, I don't think Stafford's terrible in like the QB 15 range to QB 17 range. That's fine. But if you're drafting him as a low end QB1, this is the kind of profile that we generally should be fading year over year.
I mean, this is, since we've been doing this show, I'm trying to think how many years we've actually done this home and home. I think 5 or 6. And I think the previous year quarterback that had the 7.5% touchdown rate has been a staple of this program every year. I think it was Baker Mayfield last year. I don't remember who it was the year before. But if you just go down and check each year, it'll be that guy. And just unfortunate it's Stafford. I mean, the Rams definitely were trying to get him at one point, get him to MVP. Like it's just tried and true. I mean,
it's like crazy how many more touchdowns he had last year than you can't just say it was only Devontae Adams.
Yeah.
You can't just point to that and be like, oh yeah, he threw 17 more touchdowns because of that.
He does have one other 40 touchdown season with the Rams, but I mean, you look at, so last year the Rams as a team, They reached the red zone or scored a long-range touchdown by proxy to skipping the red zone on 54.2% of their drives. Only the 2007 Patriots had a higher rate than that. And then you just look at the short yardage touchdowns that he had. 73% of their touchdowns were through the air last season. The previous 3 years, the Rams were at 59.5%, 59.1, 51.6%. It's just so much stuff lines up where they were just trying to get him these touchdowns. They're like natural regression, probably a little bit of a boost for the running touchdowns to be up. Like you said, they're probably going to be in a little more, if the defense is this good, they'll be in better scripts. You remember at the end of the year when their cornerbacks got really banged up and, they had Trent McDuffie and Jalen Watson this year too. That's when they started to get involved in like a little bit of shootouts at the end of the year. They outright just lost to Atlanta chasing points. They actually had to score a lot of points against the Cardinals even in like week 18 when they played their starters. They played that crazy game in Seattle, right? They got pushed. The Lions pushed them in a game as well. They ran away in the second half. So just all these things lined up that just converge on Stafford, hitting that touchdown rate. I think he's still like a solid bet. Like if you want him in like your 2 QB leagues and stuff, you can, and he's affordable. Like if you still want to just like, if you break glass, right? Like if you keep pushing the position and he's there. Yeah. I don't think he's going to be like a throwaway pick at like QB 14, QB 15 when he slides in those leagues at all. But that's where he should be priced because you're not getting any rushing equity and these pocket passers. We just have so many of them down the line. Even he going where he is at a fair price, like you said, has arbitrage options. Jared Goff, I would argue Jordan Love is an arbitrage option on him as well. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. Basically this is just the PSA to just not reach for Matthew Stafford.
Right.
Is what this really comes down to.
100%.
All right, man. Next one for you.
I'm going to stay at quarterback too. Like you said, it's really hard to like really push back on anyone that says like, hey, I'm in at this quarterback. I think the market's priced pretty fair. But I think in the pocket where he still goes, Patrick Mahomes still been the toughest click for me, I think, at the position for like guys that you actually like that get drafted in every draft. Patrick Mahomes set the bar so high in his career that I feel like we've overlooked exactly what the Chiefs have given us passing and what he's giving us passing the last like 3 years. And then like us just like always are constantly chasing like that ghost of what we saw the ceiling, right? When a player or like a team shows you their ceiling, it feels like, man, like what if they just get that back? Like, because this is the cheapest Mahomes has ever been. That's the argument you always hear, right? Like this is the cheapest Mahomes has ever been. And I do think if you're in like a 2 QB super flex keeper league, he is appealing in those formats because in 2027 the offense could just be outright different again, and he's a year removed from the ACL. But over the past 3 years, Patrick Mahomes is 17th in the NFL in completion rate. He is 23rd in yards per pass attempt. He is 20th in touchdown rate. He is 20th in interception rate. From just a passing points perspective, he's not been good. And now what has helped him last year was that he was the QB4 in points per game because he ran more than ever. He had 25% of his fantasy points came from rushing alone. That was the highest rate of his career. He himself, even before we get to the injury, has said, I think I maybe was running too much last year. And he's coming off the ACL, so we just can't count on that. Even if he does like start to ramp up and he does scramble more as the season goes on. The passing stuff's really hard to bank on coming back. Because a lot of people say, well, Matt Nagy's gone and they're getting Eric Bieniemy. But like Eric Bieniemy's overlap also is Apex Tyreek Hill, prime Travis Kelce. What did Eric Bieniemy do after he left Kansas City to like give you a vote of confidence to say like, you know what, it was probably Eric Bieniemy's, like that's why this all worked out. So bringing him back is going to work out. Matt Harmon brought this up, and far be it from us to push back on anything Andy Reid is going to do in his career, because he's going to walk right into the Hall of Fame and he's been an incredible head coach. But when you look at the way the NFL has tried to solve for this defensive meta, and you could argue the Chiefs were at like the forefront of driving us to this point, they have not done like the easy button stuff. Like they're not doing the under center pre-snap motion stuff. Now they're going to do some of that more this year with Kenneth Walker, but they never changed anything with their wide receiver room. I mean, the big thing that's happened while the NFL has changed defenses is the Chiefs have gone the opposite way. Teams have just started to play more man coverage against them because they don't respect their wide receiver room. You look at the man coverage stuff for Mahomes the past years. I mean, 26th in quarterback rating, 21st in completion rate, 28th in yards per pass attempt. And they run this offense through a very Deebo Samuel-esque player and Rashee Rice. Great for fantasy that he's used that way. Xavier Worthy, if you want to give him a hall pass for year 2, that's fine. But like, we still have to take a step of faith that he's going to play better in year 3. He still has an undersized receiver. You put hands on him. Can he beat man coverage? And then on top of all this, I mean, Kansas City has a gauntlet. I mean, they have a rough paper. They opened the year with Denver in week 1. They have a little soft little pocket. But remember, Mahomes is a week 5 bye, so he's the earliest bye. So you have to plan on, like, you might not want to play him in week 1 because he faces Denver. And then he has a week 5 bye, so you need a quarterback for him in that. So you're probably taking 2 quarterbacks with Patrick Mahomes in 1 quarterback leagues. And then outside the bye, Chargers, Seahawks, Broncos, like those aren't going to be spots where you're going to count on like pure passing volume to get you there. And then, in the fantasy playoffs at the end of the year, it's rough. And like that, there's fluidity there. Like we could have injuries. These defenses could not look as good by the time we get to that point of the season. But, Patriots, 49ers, Chargers, like you're not excited about those on paper either. So when I look at Mahomes and some of the guys going after him, I just think like they're still just outright better clicks to keep waiting at the position. And there are still guys after him that I think give you a little bit of that dual purpose, that like duality, that give you a little bit of rushing, depending on, where Jackson Dart goes. We got Bo Nix in there. Like we brought up, even Stafford going after her. Like Stafford is probably arbitrage of Mahomes now, and maybe is even better. So yeah, I get it. I get all the things like the cachet of the Mahomes brand and the price is as cheap as ever been, but I still think he's a really tough click where he's at.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Look, he had 5.2 points per game last year via rushing. His previous career high was 3.5. I mean, it was very clearly a totally different season on the ground for him. Now he's coming off an ACL, and oh, by the way, they finally invested in a running back who is good, right? That can create explosives. I think that there's a very real chance that we just see them completely change the way they operate too close to the end zone, which is going to be a really big deal for his fantasy value. He's also been like, The crazy thing is that there's been all this Cyrus Allen hype, which I think is fine. Like he was an interesting day 3 pick. But they almost like need him to hit the way that this offense is situated right now. Like they need that piece and that versatility of the offense, because like Cyrus Allen's profile was pretty vertical in college, and he was able to, he played a decent bit in the slot, but he played outside too. He had some verticality to his game. And I think it would be mega helpful if they just like had a hit at wide receiver, because it's just how they've been operating is just not, as you said, not been working. So I'm with you with Mahomes and him coming off the ACL, assuming that he can maintain some of that rushing production is to me a little bit foolish, especially because they added Kenneth Walker to the mix. All right. My next player, I'm going to go with TreVeyon Henderson next. So I was in on Henderson last year. It was a mistake. Okay. I regret sort of my process, but obviously the end decision. He had his moments. I don't think he was nearly as big of a bust as he could have been, but obviously it ended up being not a great season for TreVeyon Henderson. I look at what's going on right now in New England. The drumbeat is pretty loud in Ramondre Stevenson's favor. I would say at least it's not moving in TreVeyon Henderson's favor. And our baseline, in my opinion, should be that Ramondre Stevenson is the lead back in the backfield, or at least like the RB1A. Look at what happened in the playoffs last year. Stevenson had a 71% snap share to Henderson's 31%, 13% target share to Henderson's 5%, 55% route share to Henderson's 25%. And last year in total, because of this resurgence that Stevenson had during the second half of the year, he was so much better the second half of the year versus the first half of the year. He was first among qualified running backs in rushing yards over expected per rush, according to Next Gen Stats. He was also first in catch rate over expected among qualified running backs, according to Next Gen Stats. So he was both good on the ground and through the air. Ramondre was, all while being, as we know, the better pass blocker and the guy who was better in pass pro. And so I look at what's going on here and I worry. I know there was a recent report about how we could see a 50-50 split where Ramondre gets the early down stuff and the short yardage and goal line work, and TreVeyon plays more on third downs. But there was a caveat that said, if the pass pro holds. And that's a big caveat. Like, that's a really big deal. Last year, when Ramondre Stevenson was healthy, he had an 88% long down and distance snap rate. Whereas TreVeyon Henderson, if you include the games that Ramondre was out, was under 30%. So they used Ramondre Stevenson in those scenarios. And I think the pass pro stuff is a very real concern, because as they were using Ramondre, the Patriots last year ran just 27% of their plays while trailing. That was the lowest in the league. The schedule's tougher this year, so that's a number that's going to be hard to maintain. And if that's the case, Stevenson played twice as many snaps as TreVeyon Henderson did last year when the Patriots were behind. So I'm just very, very worried. I get the allure with TreVeyon Henderson. Trust me, I fell into it last year. I get the big playability. And historically, Rich, what he did as a rookie running back, if you look at his explosive run rate, his big playability, those guys do generally pan out at a decent rate moving forward. The difference between what I talked about with the Denver backfield to what I'm talking about here with New England's, because everyone knows that I'm an analyst that wants you that will tell you to chase upside once you get into the middle rounds and stuff. TreVeyon Henderson's got a pretty big opportunity cost where he's going. This is not a RJ Harvey situation where you can get him 2 rounds later or 3 rounds later when there's a very, very big drop in the kind of wide receivers and honestly other running backs that you will be drafting him over. I'll take DeAndre Swift over TreVeyon Henderson all day. I think he's a far better pick than Henderson. I would argue very strongly that Bashaw Tutin, despite the reports right now, has a higher ceiling than TreVeyon Henderson does, because the environment he's in, maybe you could say, is a little bit worse. I wouldn't even argue it's substantially worse, but the competition's Chris Rodriguez versus Ramondre Stevenson, right? Of course you would say, the TreVeyon Henderson's talent profile is better. Sure, I get it, but I think that you're at least having those discussions very, very easily and clearly. And so there's a lot of opportunity costs at running back, but there's also opportunity costs at wide receiver, like Christian Watson types, right? Guys who have a lot of upside as your wide receiver 3 that you're going to be drafting TreVeyon Henderson over. When Henderson, to me, I think he's going to enter the season as at best the 1B in this backfield. So at this moment, and I had this decision that I had to make in our Apex League that we're in, and where there was a big drop off but I needed to go running back, and there was a big drop off at both running back and wide receiver, so it was fine to go this direction. But I just took Ramondre Stevenson straight up over Travion Henderson in that draft, and to me, it's just the safer bet at this moment, and one where if you are a little bit thin at running back, and you don't have the opportunity to sort of just like shoot for the moon and chase that ceiling, I do think you should go Ramondre in those situations. And I do have Ramondre, I think, in the same tier, but ranked ahead of Henderson right now, because I'm worried about what this will look like when we saw the success that they had when Ramondre was more so the lead back.
Yeah, this is a very tough backfield to diagnose, like in terms of just like, because, all right, so let's say we simulate this season 10 times. I would say, 6 to 7 times out of the simulation, it's just like both these guys are like hurting each other. And then you get a vice versa, like when, guys go down. It's going to be very hard, I think, because even Ramondre outside the playoff stretch, when kind of the chips are on the table, and remember, Henderson had like a late season concussion that opened the door back up for, Stevenson. Right. Like the Stevenson stuff's like very small sample stuff too. Then when you look at just kind of like from a ceiling perspective, I mean, Henderson had the highest yardage total for either of these backs, and it came in a game with Stevenson playing. That was the Buffalo game. Mm-hmm. And then Henderson actually had 7 of the top 11 yardage totals of this backfield of the season last year. Right. But then it's just like, how does this work with both guys? Like, you almost have to have a Detroit Lions type run out where you're pattern matching, like Henderson is Gibbs and Stevenson's Monty, right? And like, that's just really hard. Like, it's just really hard to have 2 running backs on a team operate to that degree. This Patriots offensive line is good, like if you would get it, but like you said, the schedule is a lot harder to bank on that. They added A.J. Brown. They added Romeo Doubs. So they're going to have like 2 full-time receivers when last year they had no full-time receivers. It's a very tough team, I think, from a fantasy projection stance, outside of just saying, A.J. Brown's going to be a good pick. Yeah, right, right. So I've had a real hard time. And then, so the thing is, like, I want to be in on Henderson, the player. He's like what I look for, the upside, like the 4 50-yard touchdowns. We haven't had a rookie running back do this since Saquon. We haven't had a player have 2 games at multiple 50-yard touchdown runs since Chris Johnson in 2009. This is the level of player we're working with. But you brought up the big thing with Travion Henderson is the cost. Like, This guy's going in just a hotbed of how I've been building my teams in 2026. I'm almost always taking wide receivers where his pocket comes up. Same. And then, like you brought up too, even the running backs, he's going like, even in full PPR, he's going like right after David Montgomery, who we know is going to have more touches and maybe more touchdown equity. You brought up Bashal too, and he's kind of sandwiched in between those guys. Jadarian Price. Could Jadarian Price hit early in the season enough to like where if Charbonnet comes back, he's just, the things are in motion and he's got that body of work and he's taking over. There's just a lot of stuff around his pocket. You can even kind of start to talk yourself into like looking at the QB ones in that range too. I rarely am, but also the tight ends in that range too are a little bit more appealing too. So he just really falls into a pocket where he's just a tough click, because I just feel like so much more confidence in every other player around him. Yeah. Even for him being, so auctions are where I'm targeting him. Like to kind of dabble just to see, because you mitigate some of the opportunity cost in auctions, and then maybe some large field stuff where just the running back pool gets diluted because everyone's hammering these running backs earlier. And who knows if the next 3 weeks go like this weekend, there's be some jostling in that RB2 range anyways.
Yeah. I mean, look, I do want to be clear. Like, I think that Travion Henderson is fine in a running back heavy build if you go that direction. Like, the problem though is if you're going running back heavy and you're starting robust RB and you have like 2 or 3 in the first 4 rounds, my argument would be you should be taking a wide receiver in round 5. You shouldn't be thinking about going Travion Henderson's direction at the early parts of that round. But let's just pretend that he slips, right? And you have a couple of wide receivers and you already have 2 or 3 running backs early. I think it's fine if he slips to like the 6th and he's there, and that totally, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about liking players or not liking players on today's episode versus their cost. I think Henderson makes a lot of sense for a lot of builds. My bottom line is that, you have to speak to what is most likely going to happen, which is ADP. And again, I just think that there's a lot of running, like there's to me, there's a lot more, there's just more safety concerns with him based on the fact that Ramondre is more than likely at least going to start the season as their lead guy. And then maybe Travion starts to take over a little bit. I just don't see this as the same kind of scenario as like a Denver backfield or something where the cost is so much different. And where you, and honestly too, like once you get into like the early 60s in drafts, that's when there's a very clear drop off, in my opinion, at both running back and wide receiver. And right before that, I can see him being at the bottom of that like final tier of guys, like at the, end of the fifth into the sixth round. That's where I think he belongs more, but he's not usually there in the end. And like I said, if you want to play it a little bit safer and you need, again, that was my RB2 situation because I went really wide receiver heavy in that draft. I would then just take Ramondre Stevenson over Travion Henderson, but I have them in the same tier because that's giving you this idea of, okay, what does my team build look like right now? Okay, I can then pivot to which guy I want based on what I've done earlier in the draft. But I think there's a lot of risk with Henderson. I like him as a player. I'm still optimistic about his future. I just worry a little bit about what we're going to see here in 2026.
I think that Apex draft that we're in, and a lot of people that are listening to the show, a lot of people that they are familiar with are in that draft. Ian Harderts, Mike Clay, Sean Siegel, Matthew Harmon, and Travion Henderson. I believe that's where he was priced appropriately, and he went to a team roster construction that made sense for him.
Right. Exactly.
I actually had a chance to take him, and I took Jarian Price over him as my RB3, and he would have been my RB3. But he went RB27 at pick, 71? He had pick 71.
And honestly, it might even be later than where I would have taken him. You know what I mean? Like it was like, but you're right. I think that's about where he should probably be going, just given the risk profile.
Yeah, and he went to a team that had Jahmyr Gibbs at its RB1 and then just hammered wide receiver afterwards and said, hey, I'm fine having this volatility but upside as my RB2. And that team also grabbed Jordan Mason later as kind of like maybe like a insulation on that part too. But that's kind of, I think, where you see like a group of, I don't want to pet us, maybe removing myself, sharp individuals. This is kind of where you see, like, when you get a bunch of people that are like playing the game inherently, like the way we believe we're playing it optimally, all in the same room, and where he's priced, it feels right.
Yeah. Agreed. All right. You have one more to go over, but it's more than one here. So let us hear it.
Yeah, I'm cheating, and it's funny because you were heading down the Denver Broncos path, but obviously there are Broncos you want to draft. But my last kind of fade here is the Arizona Cardinals as a collective. Let me break this down as it goes to each position too, and I'll try to do my best here because I don't want to just like hammer. I don't want to take like 15 minutes on each player. The Cardinals are the only team this year not favored in any game entering the year. They're projected to score the fewest points in the NFL. I do believe there's enough talent here to where they aren't 32nd in points.
Yeah.
But then this team got absolutely ramrodded by the schedule this year. So the NFL, we know your opponents, right? Like it's set. But the where you play and when you play these teams is up to the league. Arizona opens the year against the Chargers, the Seahawks, the 49ers, the Giants, the Lions, the Rams, the Broncos, the Cowboys, the Seahawks, the Rams, the Chiefs, the Commanders, and the Eagles. Week 14 bye. There are two spots on there where you're like, that could be okay. Not only are they front loaded against teams that literally, I just ran off a bunch of Super Bowl contenders.
Right.
To compound matters, they play 4 home games through 11 weeks. And their 4 home games are against the Seahawks, the Lions, the Broncos, and the Rams. So like they have to go on the road when you're like, yeah, Giants could be fine, right? Or like, Commanders. They have to go on the road for those games too. So it's even like they didn't even get a hall pass on there. This team too, I think when a lot of people are looking at the Cardinals and saying, hey, what happened last year? If they're bad again, we can run that back. And like, it just can't, like, you have to look at what happened to the 2025 Arizona Cardinals in isolation. Like, not only did Kyler Murray get injured, their entire backfield got injured. No running back even carried the ball 100 times for them this season. The offensive line, their most frequent offensive line combinations on the field for 23% of their snaps. It was 26th in the league. The defense was obliterated on injuries at every level. The final 9 games of the year, the Cardinals led for 47 offensive plays. Only the Raiders and Jets had fewer. And just that intersection of events created an offensive environment that you just don't see year over year be sustainable. At the end of the year, Trey McBride ran 694 routes. Just under 700 routes. It was the most ever by a tight end since we've had route data. The previous high was 623. To add some context to this, the average tight end one, like a high usage tight end, runs 30 to 35 routes per game. So Trey McBride essentially last year played 22 football games last year. He ended up running 120 routes more than the next tight end, which was Kyle Pitts. which is basically 4 extra games worth. And what that did is it created the largest tight end 1 to tight end 2 disparity in league history. Kyle Pitts only produced 66.7% of Trey McBride's total. It was only the 3rd time since 1990 that a tight end 2 failed to produce 75% of the tight end 1 output. And just the 10th time over the past 35 years, we've had the tight end 2 be fewer than 80% of the tight end 1's output. So even if you believe Trey McBride's going to be the tight end 1 again, which I still think he's going to be fine in the context of tight end scoring, you just have to bet on the field being better versus the tight end 1 this season. And then, that all bled into Michael Wilson was, second in the NFL with 630 routes run. We had a 330 route sample with him with Marvin Harrison on the field, and he only was targeted on 12% of his routes. Even when the back half of the season, happened, and Marv came back and played, and we already saw Michael Wilson build up some head of steams, it completely reverted back to Marvin Harrison. His target per route rate was only 17.9% of his routes with Marvin Harrison after Jacoby Brissett took over. And then Marvin Harrison Jr., we're just 3 years in, and you're saying, what do we have here? Then when you look at the Cardinals, and I said that schedule, that week 14 bye is the big point that I want to bring up, because if we don't believe the Cardinals have enough wins by week 14, and their schedule actually is okay for the fantasy playoffs, we have to believe that's at least the point, that the final firewall where Carson Beck's not playing.
Right.
And they're just giving him a look the final month because they're going to be in the mix to draft a 2027 quarterback. And they just have to see him against live fire. And we could see him earlier than that too. But that's the firewall where I think we see Carson Beck. And then we're counting on Carson Beck in the fantasy playoffs to carry our guys. And it's just a really tough bet. I'm actually pretty neutral with the market, like in Jeremiah Love, and where I was before this weekend. We'll see kind of where everything kind of settles at with where he kind of is. But I just look at this team and I look at their whole team environment, and I factor in where we're going to be looking at these guys down the fantasy stretch. And I just kind of say I'm going to probably go in another direction versus all these guys.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. Even, Marvin Harrison Jr., I'm a couple of spots below, consensus wide receiver wise. I'm a decent bit below with Michael Wilson because of those splits last year. And Trey McBride, technically my tight end 2 still, but where he gets drafted in the context of where Brock Bowers goes, I have a much, much bigger gap between those two. And I think McBride should go more in the later 3rd as opposed to the late 2nd, you mentioned the routes run stuff. I wrote this in the guide where McBride averaged about 0.45 fantasy points per route run last year. If those 120 routes were declined, were taken away from him, so he still ran the most routes in the NFL at tight end. Yeah. He just ran a normal number of routes. He would have ended up scoring 15.4 PPR points per game instead of 18.6 PPR points per game, which is look, 15.4 points per game is good, really good, but it's certainly not like what you're drafting for. Not only that, but he had some unsustainable stuff in end zone targets, and the way that he was targeted, in the red zone, and his touchdown scoring, something that we never thought that we would be saying about Trey McBride after the way that he started his career and what he did in college too. But I'm with you. It's a very scary offense. I think you could even take a step backwards, and maybe this will sound idiotic by the end of the year, but are we this confident in a Jacoby Brissett led offense? I know that he played better last year than what was expected, but I even think if you just dumb this down to that degree, aside from buying into the volume stuff, because I think you can make the argument that Michael Wilson, if there's one profile that looks like last year's Jerry Jeudy, it's Michael Wilson, where the splits look really good when that's what happened with Jeudy when Cedric Tillman was injured and when he had Jameis Winston, and it's the exact same kind of scenario. I think that there's at least a little bit more to like about Wilson, and maybe there is just a slightly later breakout with him. Regardless of all of that, I just think it's scary to be investing in a Jacoby Brissett led offense the way that we're investing in. So there's just a lot of scariness to the Arizona Cardinals offense, but maybe they surprise us. We'll see.
Yeah, and like I said, when you just put dollars for donuts where all these guys go in ADP, excluding Brissett, who's not going to go in any one QB leagues. Yeah. You could, if you want to take him in 2 QB, no pushback really. But it's just where they go in drafts. There's just another guy in that point where you just have more confidence in their terms of offensive environment, and that's what makes it really tough. Because I think Marvin and Michael Wilson are largely probably fairly priced where they go, but. Again, are you going to take, Marvin Harrison Jr., over over even Christian Watson, right? Like no chance I'm doing that. Or Parker Washington, who we talked about earlier on the show. Are you taking him over where we start to look at quarterbacks? Are you going to take him over like a Caleb Williams, Dak Prescott, where he usually goes against, so it's just, I just think it's just really hard when you get to each portion of the draft where those guys come up. And even if you think they're fairly priced, there's just no insulation there.
Right. All right, my last guy is Tony Pollard. We actually talked before the show, and some of the higher end guys you mentioned, I certainly would have mentioned like an Achane. So I'm just so people know, I am in agreement with everything that Rich brought up today. But Pollard's a guy that I have pretty heavily faded this year, even in best ball. Like I just have not clicked his name. That's a range of best ball drafts where there are those really elite quarterbacks still going, like Jaden Daniels and Jalen Hurts and the upside guys. But even some wide receivers will slip there. And just straight up, like I want Ramondre Stevenson over Tony Pollard, for instance, right? I'd rather just go that route. Contingent upside still sits there with Stevenson in a way better environment. But let's just talk about Pollard. I just think it's a very traditional dead zone kind of archetype of player. He's not quite traditional dead zone. He's not quite as high, but he's the next tier down from a lot of those guys. You're definitely not buying Pollard because of his environment. There's questionable quarterback play. We already saw that in the preseason. Bad offensive line. You're doing it because of projected volume for Pollard. But I'm worried about that. He posted a yards per out run rate below 0.8 last year for the third straight year. Again, very predictive of future, or at least pretty predictive of future target share. And that target share did dip to just 8% last year. And he had that stretch without Tajay Spears last year where his usage numbers looked really good, right? But when Spears was healthy, so in that 4-game stretch without Spears, he had an 89% snap share, 69% route share. Great. They were using him as a bell cow in that backfield. With Spears, those numbers were 54% in terms of snap share and 40% in terms of route share. Now, we don't know exactly how this coaching staff is going to deploy this backfield, but Spears has been a viable pass catcher. We saw Spears play a lot with Cam Ward in their preseason game for what it's worth. I'm not saying that's definitive, that's the way they're going to deploy things, but I think that he's a legit threat. And then also maybe later in the season, they want to see what they have in Nick Singleton. I know he had a bad pass pro rep that was going viral, but they might want to see what they have in Singleton also later in the season. It's just, to me, I want to, in this range of drafts, I would much rather be shooting for the better offensive environments than going with a guy like Pollard, who's, getting closer to 30 years old, just hasn't been the same back that he was even a couple of years ago. And now that Tajay Spears is healthy, and obviously they drafted Nick Singleton, I just worry about what that volume is going to look like as the season goes on.
Yeah, and Pollard, the only caveat I'll say for Pollard is I will take him when I take Tootin or Jadarian Price. Like, because he's insulation. I like that. It was like the same process that got me so I was not bullish on Travis Etienne or Javonte Williams last year, but when I was taking, and I recommend this in the draft guide, was when I was taking Trevion Henderson and RJ Harvey last year, I was like, this is where you take Etienne and Javonte Williams, just as hey, these guys can at least, they won't be a zero for you if these guys turn out to be zeros. Right. That's the only time I take Pollard, but you just look at the profile. He's had more than 6 touchdowns in one NFL season. How many touchdowns is he going to score on the Tennessee Titans? You brought up the splits with Tajay Spears, who got a little bit of usage. At one point, this is a guy in a contract year who they were talking about maybe cutting or trading this offseason. If they're just, going down the drain, do they just play Singleton just to see what he has? There's just a lot of, outs here where you just don't have a lot of upside or like true median. Like I said, the only spots I'll take him is when I'm looking just for like that glue, just like to patch up like where I took a little risk. Like, because if I take a Gibbs, a Bijan, a CMC, then I treat it as like almost like an anchor build, and then I'm taking like a Jadarian Price or one of those other guys. But that's really it. That's the only time I'm taking him. And
he'll fall sometimes, but like a lot of these platforms have him at like RB27, RB20. Like I'm like 4 or 5 running back spots below that, and that's not just 4 or 5 running back spots. It's also overall ADP, where I'd rather be going wide receivers instead of going after, you're not forced to take a running back in that range. But like, if you're in any sort of PPR format and you're staring at like Jaylen Warren versus Tony Pollard, like I'm taking Jaylen Warren, I'm taking Ramondre Stevenson for the upside case of what they can do as receivers. like Warren especially is just someone who's just been a unbelievably good football player. I know that there's risk of split backfield, but I would argue there's a risk of split backfield here with Tony Pollard too.
Well, I mean, their contingency upside is far greater because we've seen it with Pollard already. Like he's the lead running back for the Tennessee Titans. He's basically been the last 2 years.
Exactly. Right. Like what are we really hoping for here? So yeah. So Pollard's been someone that I just haven't clicked very often at all this year. But Rich, this was fantastic as usual. Let everyone know where they can find you and what you're going to be working on, over the next couple of weeks until the season starts, but then also in the season.
Yeah, like we're finishing up the draft guide, kind of, please turn injuries off these last 3 weeks. I mean, it feels like every week. And yeah, I don't know about you, but it's not the big injuries like we can deal with because like there's things that go in motion. Like if a guy's going to be out for the year, we can kind of divvy up. Right. It's the injuries that we've had, like the Egbuka, Breece Hall, Jeremiah Love, like could this get into the season? Could it not? Yeah. Like what do you adjust? Yeah. Like these are the toughest ones to kind of diagnose because you also want to keep 1 foot in on some guys you like too. And it's like, all right, like, so those are tough, but please turn injuries off these last 3 weeks. But so finish up the draft guide. And last year you guys helped me out a lot on this program because, JJ has the best podcast in fantasy football and the best audience. And you guys loved the promo I dropped last year. So I'm going to drop one more here for you. And it just JJ and you guys are all my people too. If you like JJ stuff, you probably like mine, but you can use promo code DRAFT at Sharp Football Analysis and you get the draft guide for free. I'm just going to give it to you guys for free. So check that out. And then I also do this show with JJ. We oscillate where the Voids were his show this year. We're going to do my show. We're going to do the targets and JJ will have first pick of the targets. So look for that next week to see the guys where we're not pessimistic on.
Yeah. This is the downer episode. We get to do the fun one next week where we're excited about these guys. But Rich, appreciate it as always. Everyone listening, make sure you check out lateround.com. Check out the draft guide. Make sure you are subscribed to both the podcast and the YouTube channel, youtube.com/@lateroundff. Otherwise, everyone, thanks for tuning in.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.